All right, one more time, I promise. I figure that if we're out for the next month, God willing, we'll be back in class when we're supposed to be, like April 20 something ish. Then these 4 PowerPoints that I have posted under the Writing Center module will be enough to give us practice and get us some points. So this will be the last one in this section, and I'll go ahead and narrate it. We're going to talk just a little bit about other punctuation marks, and in some textbooks this chapter would be called tricky punctuation marks because they do have a little bit more going on than maybe our regular periods and commas and that kind of thing, but they are highly useful. And I always like to say that, hey, if you want to impress your reader, the best way to do that is to demonstrate that you understand how to use powerful words. We love our vocabulary. And you also have a command of sentence structure, syntax, and the use of punctuation can be a big part of it. So we're going to look at 5 tricky punctuation marks. I like to call them the Fab 5 in no particular order, but we are going to look at these as something that I hope you try in our remaining papers to use once in a while when they're appropriate to enhance and to clarify your purpose. So we don't want to shove them in there if we're not quite sure what they're for, but I think you'll see that they do have some pretty unique reasons to be in an essay. Let's begin with the first mark, which is the lovely colon, right? The 2 dots on top of each other. And a colon is going to be primarily a mark of introduction. I always like to compare the colon to a megaphone. If you see that in a piece of writing, it's like you're about to shout something from the rooftops, or at least it's something probably important because it's set apart. So a mark of introduction. Here is one of the most important points to remember about a colon, which I see people get mistakes on all the time. Please only use it at the end of a complete statement. We don't want to use it, let's say if your idea was, my favorite books are, and then you put a colon, because my favorite books are is not a complete sentence. If you said my favorite books are the following, then you'd be okay, but please make sure it is a complete statement. Okay, I apologize that some of these references are a bit dated. I don't even know if these celebrities are still with us or what they're doing lately, but here we go. So the first thing that a colon can introduce is a list. This is fairly standard, right? So here's an example. The following criteria are required if one wants to be a young celebrity. So that's a complete statement. And now you're waiting for a list of what those criteria would be. And then we just list them: hair extensions, cocky attitudes, and multiple DUI citations. And if you watch the PowerPoint on commas that I posted, you recognize that one of the major uses of a comma is in a list. And so we see a list here with commas, and that's followed by the colon, which is the list of criteria. All right, here's another use for the colon. Or another example of introducing a list. Amanda Bynes, I don't know what she's doing lately, has 3 hobbies. So notice that, complete sentence. We're wondering what those hobbies would be. We put the colon in there, and then we follow it up with a list and commas between the items in the list. So drinking alcohol, using marijuana, and driving while under the influence of both. That's charming. So another way in which we use the colon is if we're trying to present a long or formal quote. If you were using something in a research paper that was perhaps over 3 lines of your writing, that would be considered a long quote. But I think mostly what we would use this for would be if we just want to have it stand off as formal, as more academic. Of course, also, if you guys remember from the comma PowerPoint, commas are traditionally used to introduce quotes. But if you choose to use a colon, it's just going to look a little bit fancy. So here's wonderful historic figure, Winston Churchill. So pretty famous guy, pretty formal guy. Winston Churchill once stated, and then I get that colon in there rather than a comma, and then I get his statement. So you wouldn't be wrong to put a comma there, but that colon designates that maybe it's a higher level of importance or formality. So just something to think about. And then the final use of a colon. So we've got introducing a list, introducing a formal or lengthy quote, and then introducing an explanation. A good example of that would be, there are two things in life that Mr. Phillips hates. Now that's a complete sentence, but your reader is wondering, what are those two things? And you notice it's not a list, because we're only talking about two things. You need three or more to make a list. And it is explaining what those two things are. So spiders and children. And we do not capitalize what comes after the colon. It's okay that this is not a complete sentence, but what comes before it is. So colons can be incredibly neat tools to use as introductions. Probably for us, the second mark is more common, and we've already talked about how nice this is, the semicolon. And a semicolon has two functions. I think the second one we probably will not see that much of. This is the one that we tend to use the most. So you're going to take two complete sentences, because first and foremost, a semicolon is a period. That's why it has that dot on top. So two complete and related sentences. And then the comma that comes underneath it is to designate that these have to be related ideas. So two sentences that you would rather do something more than put a period in between, because you want to show their relationship. You actually combine them into one sentence by using the semicolon, and you're doing that as a way of manipulating the way the writing is to be read, and again, to raise the elevation. If we were to say, Professor Rawlings yells at us for no good reason. Complete sentence? No problem. We have learned to ignore her. Also a complete sentence, but related, because Rawlings is being ignored. We do not capitalize the W. This is one sentence. If you were to say, Dr. Phil sometimes yells at his guests, I'm assuming Dr. Phil is still around and doing his TV shows. So Dr. Phil sometimes yells at his guests. That's a complete sentence. However, he is always smiling as he does so. And remember, we look specifically at how to use a semicolon with a transitional word followed by a comma. So beautiful construction here, and exactly what you would want. Related ideas connected by the semicolon. What you don't want to do with a semicolon is to jam things together that don't have a relationship. So here's a terrible example. The window washer hates his job. Okay, that's a complete sentence. I want chocolate peanut butter cake for dinner. I actually do, but that does not go along with anything to do with the window washer. So don't use semicolon that way. And then also watch for this. So Paris Hilton, whatever she's doing these days, Paris Hilton's beauty may make up for her missing brains. That's a complete sentence, but not for her reckless alcohol use. That is not a complete sentence. So we would not put a semicolon there. We would just continue with the sentence. No punctuation mark would be needed at all. All right, so careful with that. And here's the second function of a semicolon, which, like I said, I'm thinking you're not going to use this too much. This is when you have a list, but the items in your list are fairly complex because those items themselves are going to require commas. It's not just a straightforward list where you're rattling off single words. I like pasta, pizza, and enchiladas. But instead, the items in the list have more to them. So here's a great example. The following would be useful to have if one ever got stranded on an island. Look at that beautiful colon right there. So I can put a colon to introduce my list because this is a complete sentence before the colon. But now look at the items in my list. A tent with a floor, windows, and mesh door. That's one item in my list. And that one item has two commas in it. So how confusing would it be if I just continue to put commas between the items in the list? Then I go to my next item, a large backpack with water, snacks, and spare socks. That's a second item. I use the semicolon to separate that. And then I get my third item and a kind, cute companion. So I really have 3 items in this list, but each item needs commas. So the semicolon is useful to make that much easier to navigate. So if you ever have a need to write a pretty complex list like that, go right ahead, but notice that the semicolon is going to be necessary. Mark number 3 is the hyphen. Not a lot that you would probably be doing with this, but it's worth mentioning that the hyphen has 3 main functions. And we are going to bypass this first function pretty quickly because we don't do this in academic writing, especially anything that's typed. It doesn't make sense. But we do see hyphens sometimes in handwritten work where you get to the end of a line and then you can't fit in the rest of the word. And so you put the hyphen in an area of the word that could divide it. Everyone in the media agrees that Paris Hilton is the perfect celebrity for an entertaining gossip column on spoiled, rotten prisoners. So doing that in typing doesn't make any sense. It's just going to go to the next line for you. But sometimes when you're handwriting your response, that could be a use for it, but I would advise against it. It is pretty annoying, right? We'd rather get the whole word on that line than have to divert our eyes to the next line and kind of snake around that way. Function number 2, it's very practical, and we see this all the time, would be in numbers. So if you have 25 acres, right, anything below 100 where we're adding the 2 words together, right, 36, 48, then that's going to have a hyphen, 68 letters on Valentine's Day. So I think we just sort of use the hyphen naturally in that kind of scenario. So not a big deal. This third function, which also may not be used all that much, but it is different than the other 2 for sure. And that would be if there's ever a time where you see that a word is created. So you're going to take 2 or more words and you're going to squeeze them together so that they act as a single word. They become an adjective that you've created. And we have some really common ones that we see a lot, including whenever you have ex, like ex-lawyer, my ex-boyfriend, my ex-boss. That's going to be a hyphen following the X. Or you could say the red-faced street bum. So I've combined red with faced. That's created 1 unit to describe a street bum. Or the smooth-talking lawyer, right? I've created that to describe lawyer. It's a single unit. You could say self-centered. So a lot of times when you have self in front of another word, I am self-sufficient. He is so self-important. Don't be so self-conscious. Those are all going to have hyphens in them. And then lighthearted is another fairly common one. Myron did not offend me with his lighthearted jokes, describing the Italian jokes. The other day I was driving by a Pier 1, which you might have noticed is on its way out, and they had a big banner across the front of the building that said, "Going out of business, sale." Well, if you're writing that correctly, which unfortunately the sign did not, going out of business, every single one of those words would be connected with a hyphen because they are all working together to describe sale. So going, hyphen, out, hyphen, of, hyphen, business. Going out of business is 1 unit. And then we have one of my all-time favorites, the dash. And that punctuation tree there is kind of cool. I'd like one of those in my yard. So a dash is a longer version of the hyphen, right? Hyphen is a half a dash. And the dash's main purpose is to fist pound. This is for emphasis. Okay, you are truly trying to bring attention to something when you use a dash. And you're doing it by slowing the reader way down. We know that the other punctuation mark that does that is, of course, the comma, but this is a comma, the old expression, on steroids. This is a much, much longer pause. So if you're trying to direct your reader to something that you want to shine a light on, use the dash. So stops the reader more than a comma, but be careful. So I do love the dash, but I don't want you to think that that means that every sentence should have a dash, because if you overemphasize everything, then you're really overemphasizing nothing. It has to be selected carefully and sparingly so that it doesn't lose its power. And there it is on our tree at the very bottom. Okay, let's look at some examples of that. So the dash, you could say my boss, long dramatic pause, an obvious sexist, long dramatic pause, has surprising popularity among women. Now you could put commas there instead of the dash, but that wouldn't have that same impact that you might want. So choose the dash. You could say Paris Hilton has no real ambition, long dramatic pause, except to stay out of jail. So you're in charge of manipulating the reader's reading. Bobby Nichols will hog all the breakfast if we let him. You could put a comma there, but for added emphasis, especially the Frosted Flakes. And I forgot the period at the end of that. Okay, here's the last one. And we will be seeing a lot more of this mark as we get into essay number 3. Because parentheses, they do have a couple of functions. The first one, not so important for us, but the second one, we cannot avoid in academic writing. So the first one, just quickly, maybe on occasion you guys will be writing a paper, maybe for a science class, where you are asked to provide a list and you're supposed to number that list. The best way to get on Professor Dillinger's good side is 2, and then you have those 3 things. So this is the right way to do that because then they're offset from the rest of the sentence. Notice there's no colon here because it is not a complete sentence preceding that, and you would just put the 1, 2, and 3. However, this is what we will be seeing a lot of. When you use a set of parentheses in writing, you are telling your reader that what's inside of those parentheses is non-essential, that it's extra. Not that it's completely meaningless, but you don't want your reader to spend too much time focusing on it. So at the bottom of the slide, you notice it says that parentheses work exactly the opposite of a dash. You are not trying to have long dramatic pauses when we see parentheses. An interesting Winston Churchill quote is, so if you want your reader to know when Churchill was born and died, you could just put it in parentheses. Okay, it's just some extra stuff. Aunt Martha, complete with prune stains on her dentures, so you don't want to embarrass her. You don't want to draw too much attention to those stains, so you put it in parentheses. Smiled for the family photo. And then the chapter covering Britney Spears' strange behavior. So if you're just talking about the pages in the book, right, those are a lot of pages. I don't need to know that necessarily. We can go ahead and offset them in parentheticals. Now for us, when we start using research and MLA formatting, which some of you may have done quite a bit of already, we use parentheses to show our research. And they're right within our essay, and we put certain pieces of information in those parentheses, but that's exactly what we're talking about here. Non-essential. We don't want the reader to get bogged down with them, but they do have a purpose. So let's just do some quick review here. Chester had an excellent excuse for being late to his English final, an early morning power failure that shut off his alarm. Let me read through these, and then on the next slide you'll see some suggested answers. Think about how you would correct them. Our neighborhood mailman, the one with the dog attached to his leg, just got picked up by the ambulance. The SCC librarians are always helpful. They can help students find almost anything. Gertrude Cox's television set is almost new, having been bought only 6 months ago, but has been making hissing noises. The two-faced politician promised a $21 per hour minimum wage. Now, really, if we were doing this for real, remember, we would use the dollar sign and we would have the number 21. So remember that rule. All right, but here are some possible answers. Notice possible because this isn't the one and only way that you could correct these, but it's a possible way depending on how you want the reader to read it. So I could put a colon here. What was the excellent excuse for being late? I want an explanation of that. Put the colon. Dashes. If I want to emphasize that he is the one with the dog attached to his leg, geez, then I could put the dash. This is a good use for the semicolon. I'm talking about how helpful they are, and then I follow that up with a related idea. They can help us with anything. If you don't think it's important to know that you only bought it 6 months ago, put it in parentheses. If you think it's incredibly important to know that, use dashes. And then two-faced to describe politician, and of course our number 21. All right. Now, like the last one, what I would hope that you would do shortly, maybe in the next day or so, is go back on Canvas. You'll see that there is a quiz posted. It has 10 questions, and it's just asking you to practice with some of these 5 fabulous punctuation marks. If you have any issues or concerns, go ahead and post to our Q&A discussion board thread. All right, thanks guys. I will be talking with you soon.